So thank you for coming. Welcome to a very unique book launch and conversation with the author, Irvin Ungar. The book is Reviving the Artist Who Fought Hitler, My Life with Arthur Szyk. We'll have a free-flowing evening of images, stories, and conversation with our very own internet famous senior fellow Paul Gross. I'm Ilana Brown of the Begin Center, and I've been given the honor of introducing Irvin. Unlike Menachem Begin, I don't speak well off the cuff. I tend to wander on tangents. And if you've ever had the pleasure of a conversation with Irvin, tangents are the best part. So even so, to keep on track, I've written my introduction, glasses on. If you'll indulge me, I also like to introduce people in unexpected ways. Less, he wrote this, he did that, and more, what you might not know or expect is. With Irvin and his work with Arthur Szyk, Szyk's art and legacy, we'd be here until next week with a full list, but that's what the book is for. Irvin will explain the discounts and how to order the book. So instead, I will follow the theme presented in the title of Irvin's book, The Begin Center's Life with Irvin Ungar. The first time I saw the name Irvin Ungar, it was at the bottom of a lovely email that Moshe Fuchsman, former deputy director of the center, shared with me in preparation to help him answer it in proper English. This was probably 20 or more years ago. The correspondents flew back and forth to see if we could somehow get an exhibition of Szyk's work at the Begin Center. At that time, we were not successful. We kept in contact over the years and kept trying to launch this exhibit. Eventually, Moshe left the center, but our life with Irvin continued. The next attempt started with a face-to-face meeting at the Begin Center. Irvin was coming to Israel. By now, Rami Shtivi, the current deputy director of the center, was looped into the conversation. Irvin came and regaled us with stories about the background of the artworks, the intricate details of each drawing, the drawing and painting techniques, the effect on history, and the deeper meaning of each work of art. I think we eventually had to stop the meeting after 2 hours, but I was inspired and I could have listened longer. Don't worry, this event will end at a specific time, even though you will want to stay longer. After that meeting, I was so inspired by Irvin talking about the Haggadah, I went home and ordered 3 copies on Amazon, one for my brother's family who received the package in the US and was coming to Israel for Passover that year, one for my friends who always invite me to Passover, and one for me. This is my copy. Also available on Amazon. After that meeting, this is my copy. Eventually, with partnerships from friends in Poland and the Polish Embassy Institute, we finally had the exhibition of Arthur Szyk's work here at the Begin Center. I made sure to invite Moshe Fuchsman to the opening, and he came to see the end result of the email exchange from 20 years ago. A true friend of the Begin Center, Irvin never gave up on us, and we never gave up on him. And now get ready for a truly illuminating and entertaining stroll through Irvin's life with Arthur Szyk, who was the lighthouse leading Irvin to great things. Please give a warm welcome to former pulpit rabbi, antiquarian, preserver of Arthur Szyk's legacy, author, and all-around nice guy. I think it's on the left.
Okay. Required we do some kind of dance, isn't it? Get ready. Okay. Thank you very much, Ilana, for that introduction. It's nice to see some familiar faces. My name is Paul Gross, senior fellow here at the Begin Center. As Ilana said, a legend in my own household. That's pretty much it. But it's nice to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to be with Irvin. Now, you and I have had a few conversations, some of which have been broadcast live over Zoom. Maybe some of you have seen them. This is the first time we were able to do this face to face, so that's an extra pleasure. This isn't the first book you've written about Arthur Szyk, but it is the first book you've written about with yourself as the subject, not just Arthur Szyk, yourself, your journey with Arthur Szyk. So maybe I'll ask you first, what prompted you to write the book and how it's different from the other what books you've written on Szyk.
Sure. First, thanks for having me, Alana, Rami, Paul. Feel like I'm coming home in a way. So every time I come to Israel over the last number of years, I always stay about 10 minutes walking distance from you, so I can get over here pretty quickly for whatever we're doing. Yes, I've written a number of books about Arthur Szyk. This one is about my journey with Arthur Szyk, which began some 50 years ago. I never met Arthur Szyk. I was 3 years old when he died in 1951, which tells you how old I am, if you calculate. In any case, I began this journey in 1975, and it all began with my discovering a reproduction of his Szyk Haggadah. And that's how this began.
Right, the Szyk book that many people will know is also the one that got this whole journey started.
It's what got it started. I needed gifts for people in my wedding party. And I was living in Manhattan. I had just finished rabbinical school. I was about to, I had taken a pulpit and I was getting married about 6 months into that after I'd started my work there. And I went to Block's bookstore in Manhattan, which was, at the time was the largest Judaica shop in America, largest Jewish bookstore. And I bought books there for my rabbinic library before, but then I walked in and I was drawn to this one part of the store and to the one corner of these, if you know, these bedboards, which would be on sawhorses that they would create tables with, and these books were piled high. And I saw in one corner these books that were in boxes. So I wasn't drawn to this spot because it was a colorful dust jacket. It was just boxes. And I went there and I opened up them, and it's when the colors leapt out at me. And I saw, here's what I saw. Let's see if I can move this. Well, oh, I know. I just did it backwards, but this helps. Here's what I saw. I saw a page that looked like this, and it was the colors and the melding of the Hebrew calligraphy with the colors. Szyk always did the calligraphy as well, and that's what got me in hello. That was my first encounter with Szyk's art, and I bought half a dozen copies, gave them to people in my wedding party, and then the next 12 years. I was an active pulpit rabbi and really didn't have time to, I really didn't think about Arthur Szyk for at least 12 years. In fact, I often kid with my friends that as a pulpit rabbi, I never really had time to think. And so I certainly wasn't thinking about Szyk at the time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So that's the initial, that was that kind of initial spark. But then obviously, as we know, it developed into something else. And was there apart from that initial introduction to Szyk with finding the Haggadah in the bookshop, was there another kind of light bulb moment that got you thinking, maybe this is going to be what I'm going to be doing? Or was it more of a gradual thing, a gradual realization, the extent to which he meant something to you and his work stirred you in some unique way?
Yeah, I think I know how this happened, in that I was drawn to him after 12 years after having met Szyk through the Haggadah. I left the rabbinate. I became an antiquarian bookseller. It wasn't something I really wanted to do, but it was enough of years in the pulpit. I wasn't well, and I didn't know what I was going to do the rest of my life. I remember how old I was. I was 39 years old. I had no clue. And a friend of mine suggested I look into the idea of maybe selling rare books and documents for a living. Well, the problem with that was I didn't have a collection to start a business. I had a collection of antique maps of Palestine, from the 18th, 19th, 18th, 17th century. That was about it. And I didn't train. My father never talked to me about business, and I hadn't gone to library science school or apprenticed with anyone, and I had no money. which are all the right reasons actually for starting a rare book business. But I began it, and soon after I discovered Arthur Szyk was, a book illustrator. But what really happened is I went to Pittsburgh, where Pennsylvania, where my wife's family was from, and every time I'd go there, I'd go to the antique shop and bookshops. And I went into this one antique shop, and there was everything all around, baseball bats, pins, buttons, everything you can imagine. This Hasidic Jew ran this shop, and my foot kicked a box underneath this table, and I lifted this box up, and it was Arthur Szyk's holiday scenes that he had done of Rosh Hashanah and Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and so on, Hanukkah. And I bought this box, and I don't know, I paid $200 or something for this whole box of reproduction prints. And I started, at that time, I was starting to have antiquarian book fairs, and I would mat them and show them. And it was then something went off in me that said, I'm not going to let this artist go, but I didn't know why. I didn't know why. But what happened next, and the holiday scenes look like this. This was Rosh Hashanah. Of these 6 holiday series prints done in 1948. By the way, they were really small, they're like this. The original art is only this size. And I was exhibiting at these book fairs, these small book fairs, and I saw a Nazi book, Nazi caricatures, that there was a bright yellow jacket, dust jacket, that Szyk illustrated in 1941. And I quickly realized that this was an anti-Nazi book, and I loved the idea that here was a Jewish artist who was doing holiday scenes and biblical themes, and he was doing also political art. And because for me, Bible's basically a political book. It's about justice, what's right, what's wrong, laws, and the way society should go. And I just love the idea that here was an artist who I didn't know at the time was steeped in Jewish tradition, although I've never really figured out how that's so, and we can talk about that. But how he combined both of those. And I really realized that this was an artist who had something to say in his art, and gradually realized that this was an artist who repeated the theme in his work. And he had actually said that art is not my aim, it's my means. And I love that. My training, how I saw my role in the world as a Jew, was what Szyk was doing through his art, which basically is like it's like Hillel, everybody knows the expression, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? That's who Arthur Szyk, he cared about the Jewish people. So much of his art has im einani li mili, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me, in his calligraphy. And then what Szyk did was he used his value system as a Jew to be an advocate for humanity, which is like, if I'm only for myself, what am I? What Hillel said. And then, of course, if not now, when? Well, Szyk was an activist, artist. I mean, you have to act, you have to do. And so what I think what connected me really to Szyk was that his art visually articulated what my value system was through words and through writing and through speaking. And so I just felt like, oh, really, this is someone who I think I could go on a journey with this artist. I think I can. I didn't know what that journey meant, but there was something there.
Yeah, because of course, if he was just, an illustrator of rare talents, then that would be one thing. But there was so much more to it, because as the title of your book, The Artist Who Fought Hitler, he had this much wider, broader cause that he was engaged in, which is art was as you say, was the means through which he was engaged in this. And what can you maybe say a little bit, and maybe if you have other examples in the presentation, of the ways in which during that period, during the Nazi period and the period of the war, he was engaged in anti-Nazi art.
Sure. Let me just say this for people who may not be as familiar with Arthur Szyk in his life. He was born in 1894 in Łódź, Poland, Łódź, and he came to America in 1940. So he came to America, and he died in the United States in 1951. So it's within those dates then I can we can talk a little bit, but at least you have to understand where he was creating his artwork. Maybe I'll give you one other date, not to bog you down with dates, but he grew up in Poland, he went to Paris, not to train. He never went to school. He was 3.5 years as a teenager from age 16 to almost 19, 20. And when he was in Paris, he was enrolled at the Academy Julienne, but over that period of 3.5 years, he went to 14 classes. So what he learned was not in a classroom. But the other date that I want to give you is 1937, because that's when he had completed his artwork on the Haggadah, and he carried it with him to London to have it printed. So he spent 3 years in London from 1937 to 1940 when he worked on this book. At the same time, he was creating anti-Nazi caricatures and cartoons, and he was attacking Hitler as early as 1933, 34 through his art. And of course, his Haggadah has a great deal of anti-Nazi imagery, which is a whole other lecture and so on. But I wanted to just go from 1937 to 1940s in London. World War II breaks out. And the Polish government in exile moved to London. They first went to Paris, then came to London. And while he was there, and Szyk had a relationship with the Polish government, he was highly respected among many people in Poland, and they traveled his art throughout Poland. And I could talk more about that, but suffice it to let me make this point, that it was the Polish government in exile and the British government who sent Arthur Szyk to America to help bring the face of the war in Europe to the Western world through his art, because his art was always done for reproduction. It's political art, to be on the front covers of magazines and newspapers, and to stir people. You know, even in America, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it was his artwork on the front cover of Time magazine showing Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese, as the aggressor. And also, you know, in New York City, he became a leading political artist for the New York Post from 1943 to 44. Over 90 works of art. His just appeared in the New York Post alone, you know, replacing the great Rollin Kirby. But they made a big deal about Arthur Szyk becoming its political artist. By the way, I should say, whenever he was in many of the articles written about him, it was the great Arthur Szyk. It was the famous Arthur Szyk. It was the world famous, the world renowned, the genius Arthur Szyk. Here there's a caption that says Szyk makes the Axis ride, but I can tell you that the word famous and well known is right there within the first paragraph. This man was famous, which is another thing we can talk about, but I just want to point out that he went on to become the leading anti-Nazi artist in America during World War II. And that's what I've had to study along the way and to make the case for that, because at the same time, he was also the leading artist for the rescue of European Jews in America. And if you haven't heard this from any place else, you are hearing it from me. And I stand by this, and we could devote lots of time to that. But you can see, this is what I feel. And this is what I feel because of everything I've poured through to really come to these conclusions, because I don't take statements like this very lightly. And I have to listen to myself after I say these, because I often listen to the interviews or I read the newspaper clippings and I go like, yeah, have you really said that? And I guess the answer is yes, but I do stand by them. And I hope this helps get us a little bit into his anti-Nazi period and his art. He was born 1894, I mentioned. That's the same year Norman Rockwell was born in America, the illustrator. And Rockwell was illustrating the covers of the Saturday Evening Post. Szyk was illustrating the covers of Collier's magazine. And they both had the same circulation in America. The Saturday Evening Post with Rockwell's covers were 3 million of each copy and 2.5 million of every cover of Arthur Szyk, except I submit to you his artwork, other than the war bonds that Rockwell created of the Four Freedoms, and more about that. And Szyk did the Four Freedoms also. And by the way, when FDR gave that Four Freedoms speech, you know, there were 38 paintings of freedom that were hanging in the White House in January of 1941, you know, 11 months before the US was in the war. There were 38 paintings of freedom hanging in Roosevelt's White House. You know who that was? Who that art was by? Well, you guessed it. It was by Arthur Szyk. Well, more about that, but that gets us into sort of that period, sort of mine. my working vocabulary in a way.
Okay, so you mentioned FDR, and of course one of the sort of stories at the time was that you had a sort of Jewish establishment in the United States that was very close to the president and supportive of the president, and then you had a much smaller group of Jews who were actually who felt that the president wasn't doing enough for the Jews, and this was the famous Bergson group. Peter Bergson, really Hillel Koch, and Ben Hecht and others who were very, very active in trying to lobby the United States to do something to rescue Jews from Europe. And Arthur Szyk was a major part of that, right?
Yeah, he was their one-man art department, and one could say he was the one-man art department for the Irgun in America. You could say that. Ben Hecht said that in his autobiography, Child of a Century. And, Szyk worked for the Bergson boys. They were the ones who took out the ads in the newspaper that attacked the State Department. They were the ones who marched on Washington and organized the rabbis who gathered at the steps. And Ben Hecht would write the text for Bergson's advertisements in the newspaper, the pamphlets, and Arthur Szyk would illustrate them. And so there would be his artwork was appearing everywhere. One of his very, very important works, The Ballad of the Doomed Jews of Europe, Be Quiet, Jews, the world is busy with other news, that Ben Hecht wrote and Szyk illustrated. At one time I thought that just appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But I found this in newspapers throughout the US and in magazines. And by the way, his artwork was everywhere, whether it's Wichita, Kansas, or it's Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or it was Chicago, or it was he was there. But he advocated strongly for the rescue of European Jews and during the war years.
Right.
Yes.
And of course, another great cause of his was Zionism, was the state of Israel, or the immigration of Jews to Israel, and his opposition to the forces that he saw trying to stop Jews coming in.
Yeah, he was. Many people who know Arthur Szyk here in Israel know him through the Haggadah, or they know him through the Iton Rishmi, the proclamation of the establishment of the State of Israel, which is what Arthur Szyk created in 1948. Maybe I'll skip a whole bunch of these slides to get to it, and I can come back to them. There you are. That's by Arthur Szyk in 1948. When he died, I knew Arthur Szyk's daughter, Alexandra, as I said, I didn't know Arthur Szyk, but I was friendly with his daughter, Alexandra, for about 25 years. And she and I, we did business together. I bought art from her. She traveled with me for exhibitions that I created in Poland and in Berlin. Even in 80 years old, she went with me for an exhibition at the German Historical Museum, which is the museum of the German government, the most important museum in all of Germany. And she went with me for that exhibit. Oh boy, I have stories about that, but it's really in a memoir, of course, but and what the relationship really was. But I really got to know her, and I also got to know Szyk also through the memoir that Arthur Szyk's wife wrote, Julia, which has not been published, but in it she said that she saw Arthur Szyk cry only 2 days during his lifetime, and one was when he heard that his mother and brother were taken from the Lodz ghetto, which is where he grew up, and they were sent on a transport. He didn't know where, and he didn't know exactly when, but he thought they were killed in Majdanek, but they were actually murdered at the Chelmno killing center. But when he felt that they were taken, his wife indicated he cried, and the second time was when Israel declared its statehood, and she said that Arthur Szyk saw those who fought for this creation of the state of Israel as if they were his own children. And when he sat down and cried, he then began to work on this proclamation of the Declaration really of Independence of the State of Israel, not commissioned, but that he created it. And it's been well reproduced in recent years. But yes, he loved the Jewish people and so much, even his Haggadah begins with the verse, you know, like if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, you know, let my right hand wither. It's the first verse on the first page in his Haggadah, and it's the last verse on the last page in his Haggadah. I mean, Jerusalem and the Jewish people and all things he had to deal with. His art was always used to elevate the prestige of the Jew in the world. That's what Szyk was interested in. That's, you know, there was an article just appeared yesterday in a newspaper, in a Jewish newspaper in San Francisco, which is where I'm from, the Northern California Bay Area. And it says how, I can't remember how a rabbi and antiquarian made Arthur Szyk famous, the artist Arthur Szyk famous. And it turns out that in the year 2000, that newspaper had interviewed me, and I always kept that clipping, which was Judaica expert sets out to make Arthur Szyk famous. And now I saw this headline from the same paper now, 26 years later, and they're referencing, well, he did it because he has this book now of reviving the artist who fought Hitler. So that's good. Problem is with the article just came out, the images aren't showing in it. So I sent them an email and said, no, we got to get those images, you know, in the article, but you know, it's the way that works, right?
Right, and we're sitting here in the Begin Center, and it's not incidental that, as Ilana mentioned, there was this initial interest in your work and in Szyk from the Begin Center because, of course, Szyk knew Ze'ev Jabotinsky personally,
That's right.
and was ideologically committed to the revisionist Zionist idea.
Yeah.
What can you tell us a little bit about his connection to Jabotinsky?
Yeah, I can, and a little bit about Begin too.
Yeah.
Well, with Menachem Begin, and I'll go backwards. So with Menachem Begin, Szyk moved to America in 1940, lived in Manhattan. In 1946, he moved to New Canaan, Connecticut, for various reasons. His doctor thought the air would be better for him, and when Jews weren't moving to Westport or in Connecticut, where he vacationed in the summer, and then New Canaan, Jews weren't just going to that area. You know, it's the Gentleman's Agreement movie was made. You know, people of that area, that community. But when he was living in New Canaan, and I met the caretaker of Szyk's home in New Canaan, which was 10 acres of land and a beautiful home with large windows. In the year 2000, I went into that house. Someone else owns it. And I saw the windows, all the light pouring through. And I went there, but while Szyk was living there from 46 to 1951 until he died, Begin, before it became visited Arthur Szyk, and I think on more than one occasion, but at least one occasion for sure, the caretaker had mentioned to me, and I found also some evidence that was indeed the case. And then his relationship with Jabotinsky began in Poland in the 20s, maybe earlier. I know that Szyk was in the 1920s, early 1920s, he also then moved to Paris. And I owned his diary, his 1927 diary. It was written in beautiful Russian script. It was so elegant. And in it, of course, I had to translate it to English by two different people. So I didn't really want to miss anything there. In the names, because he tried to take French names and people he knew. When you try to put it in Russian, you can't really figure out who they are exactly because of the way French works, the language. So you need to really study that. But it was clear that when Jabotinsky would visit Szyk in Paris, in his diary, Arthur Szyk talked about how Jabotinsky would bring news of Szyk's mother and family back in Łódź, would bring it to him. And then I found newspaper clippings of after Szyk died, and Jabotinsky, of course, had died in 1940, but Szyk died in 1951. But there's a photograph of Arthur Szyk's wife and Jabotinsky's wife together. They were friendly as couples. They were friendly individually. And I do have a sense that some of his significant artwork, or at least one work of art, was really influenced by Jabotinsky, influenced Szyk. I can show that here. but I also tell you, the poet, the writer and essays that Jabotinsky had written, his 3-volume set, Arthur Szyk had done the illustrations for that volume, and also his book on Samson, and Delilah Szyk illustrated the dust jacket for Jabotinsky's book. So they had connection in terms of, and if Szyk ever had one person who influenced him in his being a fighter. I mean, Szyk he saw himself as a soldier in art. He was a fighter, he filled out forms when he came into Canada before he came to the United States. What do you do for a living? Well, I'm an artist and I'm a fighter. That's how Szyk saw himself. So I think that of all people that influenced him, and I wouldn't say that it's someone in the art world who influenced him more than anyone else. I would say it would be Jabotinsky in Szyk's thinking.
Right.
So that's sort of a little bit into the connection between them. Yeah.
Great. I wanted to say to our audience here, we'll get to questions. So if questions arise as we're talking, then make a mental note and you'll have a chance to put them to Irvin. I want to go back a little to the Irvin Ungar part of the story.
Yeah.
So your rise to become this preeminent scholar of Arthur Szyk has, I think, and you and I have had conversations in the past, has opened quite a few doors for you into places that many of us don't get to visit. So maybe we could hear a little bit about some of the interesting places that you've been and the people you've met as a result of your scholarship.
Yeah. Well, there is one story I want to tell you. Actually, it's not in the memoir. So, but it somehow happened to me recently. I mean, but I can tell you I really had an opportunity. I was in a book, was asked to write an essay that was in the same book as Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There was like president of a university and the Pulitzer Prize winner, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in this book, and I was asked to write an essay about Arthur Szyk and freedom. And I had the nerve it was really nerving. I really wanted to. I sent her a copy of the book that had her essay in and my essay. And I also sent her a copy. Ilana held up the Szyk Haggadah there. I created a new edition of the Szyk Haggadah, and that's it. That's over there, a new translation and commentary and so on, with images quite bright and attractive. But I also sent her the book. I asked her if she'd inscribe it, and I sent her a copy of the Haggadah also as a gift. And she inscribed the book for me, and she sent me a letter. Then also, that letter thanked me for the book, and the inscription in the book where our essay is that she thanked me for having introduced her to Arthur Szyk. So at least I felt like, okay, this is pretty good. And I sort of tell a little bit about that. But during the course of my rare book business, which is how I made a living, buying and selling historic documents of Jewish interest, not Sforum as a book dealer, but books that might be the first Haggadah printed in America, or the first Hebrew Bible or the first Hebrew book ever printed in Jerusalem, for example. Those would be the kind of books, or letters signed by Einstein about the survival of Jewish people, or Ben Gurion, etc. Anne Frank, even I own something of hers, and that's in a museum now. But I had the occasion, during the book world, to meet a lot of interesting people, and I did favors for people along the way, and I had done a favor for someone. This gets you to where I met somebody really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is really interesting, but something very different is that I produced a luxury edition of this Haggadah this is printed in 2011, and in 2008, for 2 years before that, I embarked on creating a really luxury, very expensive Haggadah, bound by hand and materials imported from around the world. And I won't go into that now. Suffice to say, it's a very valuable book, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of these books that I was selling. And they're in many museums in the world and so on. So, and I don't even list all of them in here. I just say that they're in many places. But on my website, you can actually see them. But nonetheless, I done a favor for someone, and she said, "Well, Irvin, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Joanna, please, you've done enough favors for me." No, Irvin, I want to do something. I said, "Well, you could buy a premier edition of my Haggadah, which is an $18,000 book, okay? You could buy a copy of that and you could give it to the Vatican. And she said, Irv, that's a great idea. So I thought it was a great idea too. And
We all need friends with $18,000 to spend.
right. So what happened is that, you can't necessarily give a gift to the Vatican. There's a whole process, and it's a new book. It's not something that, was produced at the time of Noah's Ark or something like that the Vatican has, or what doesn't have. Ten Commandments, a little, has a second edition, maybe not the first. Smashed, right? So we don't know. But a new book. So I figured out, how to do that. We got it. So I had this whole chain of correspondence 7 or 8 years ago when it was gifted there, and I worked with the Vatican to get it. So a year ago, about a year and a half ago, I was going to Rome, and I sent that chain of correspondence to the Vatican, and I said, I'm coming to Rome, and I'd like to be able to see the Haggadah in the Vatican. So I didn't hear from them, but I was going for 2 days, and the day before, when I arrived, December 9th. Now I know the date because the next day was my birthday, December 10th. On December 9th, I got a letter from the deputy prefect of the Vatican that we would like to see you tomorrow at 12 noon. And if you're coming, you can bring a friend. We'd like to see you, and you will see your Haggadah. So I went to the Vatican on December 10th. It was my birthday. I brought a friend came with me, and I brought a gift under my arm with me when I was going, because I'm going to meet some people there, and I go with a gift. And I gave her passports to the gendarmes, walked through the Santa Ana Gate, walked into Vatican City, sat in a beautiful office with chairs, pictures on the wall, and 2 men came to greet me, both in nice suits, not in clerical garb, which would have been nice too, but they were dressed in really lovely. And I went with a jacket and a tie. I was going to go, just right. And we chatted. It was friendly conversation. We moved into a room. Now, this is not open to the public. The Vatican Apostolic Library is, it's closed off. Scholars can go there by special invitation. The public can't. And I go into this room where the ceiling is just like a vaulted ceiling, just like the Sistine Chapel. It's not exactly, but it's like it. And it's amazing. We have this conversation with a priest who's there, who turns out is a lawyer, and he's the head of this council that advises the Vatican on sensitive matters. And I have a interchange with him, and I introduce myself as Rabbi Ungar, who's also an antiquarian bookseller. So I figured on 2 levels, this could be interesting for him, and I wanted to know where I'm coming from a little bit. So we had this conversation. Then we moved into another room, and we went through this real thick metal doors, and we go into this room that's wood paneled with like 16th century wooden carvings, and there on the table where this like velvet cloth is opened the Szyk Haggadah, and the box was all handmade, and I had done a companion volume with it that's a book about the Szyk Haggadah, and it's a documentary movie, and it's pretty. So it was all there. I'm like, holy mackerel. I mean, holy, right? I'm there. So I'm there, and I say to myself, wait, I should use this opportunity to explain to them maybe one page that's in the Haggadah. It hadn't occurred to me before, and I know I brought this gift I wanted to give them, but so I took a page in the Haggadah that I thought would, just like that I knew I thought would relate to their tradition and my tradition, which was that in the Haggadah, Szyk does an illustration of the Messiah. And according to scholar Shalom Sabar, there's only one other illustrated Haggadah that has an image of the Messiah, the Mashiach. But none of them have a picture of the Messiah at the gates of Rome, and I'm in Rome. But I explained to them about the Messiah, because in their tradition and Jewish tradition, because our concept of the Messiah is very different. In the early days, we thought the Messiah was a physical redeemer, not a spiritual redeemer, right? So anyhow, we're talking, and they're leading in, and they're listening, and I'm feeling like, hey, I'm really doing something, significant here in a way. And then I took out this gift from under my arm. And what it was is I presented them with Arthur Szyk's visual history of Israel. I'm in the Vatican. I'm in the heart of the Vatican now. There it is on the right. I had a copy of that I gave them. It was signed by Arthur Szyk. And I presented it to them, and you're not going to believe this. I know you're not going to believe this. But there are pictures on the wall of all the popes. Many of the popes are history. And the pictures of the popes are seen as rabbi advocating for Israel in the heart of the Vatican, and they're coming out of their pictures. I swear. The Vatican, the popes, no, honestly, they're not coming out of their pictures. But there I am in the heart of the Vatican, and they absolutely loved being presented this. They couldn't decide which department should this go to. Should it go to manuscripts? Should it go to Hebraica? Where should it go? And I'll tell you what happened. And then we went to see treasures at the Vatican, and with this, I'm going to close. We were allowed, I asked if I could take some pictures, and they said, that's fine. When I came back home in California, I decided I'm going to write an article about my going to the Vatican, and it's going to have the pictures in it. And I had a feeling that maybe it would be printed here in Israel, but I sent it to them first, and I asked them, I'd like to publish this. What do you think of this idea? And they signed off on it and said, this is of goodwill, and we like that. And so it was published here in the Jerusalem Post and Jerusalem Report here in Israel of my trip to the Vatican. And that's how Arthur Szyk and his Haggadah led me to the Vatican.
Amazing. Amazing story. I want to ask, actually, as it's up here, there's the Israel, the illustration of Israel. There's also the illustration of the United States.
Yeah.
And one of the things that that's, I think, if you look closely at it, I hope our audience can see, is like near the top, on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, you have an African American and a Native American.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because both his opposition to Nazism and his passionate support for Israel comes from this very strong sort of moral crusade idea that he has this sort of moral thread running through his work. And this indicates that it's not just narrowly focused on the Jewish world, there's also a wider moral message. And here he's talking about civil rights and other. Can you talk about how he engaged with those issues as an American?
Yeah, this is an artist who they said that when he was 6 years old, he was already doing drawings of the Boxer Rebellion in China. How does a 6-year-old Jewish kid in school know about the Boxer Rebellion in China? At age 10 or 11, he's being thrown out of school for protesting, doing pictures of the Tsar. He's doing political drawings, and before it, he never knows, doesn't even know what the word, never could probably even spell the word politics. Who knows? But he's creating political art. Where this comes from, it's hard to say. I can tell you the kind of home he grew up in, and that would have fostered, it wouldn't have necessarily fostered this. It just, I'm not quite sure where it came from, but let me tell you the end result. Maybe we can go backwards. The end result here is, think about this. That image on the left is 1945. The war is over. And he's an immigrant in America. He's a Polish Jew who's an immigrant in America. And he has great sensitivity to the idea that World War II is over. And in the bottom left and the bottom right, a little up from the bottom, you see a white sailor on the left and a white soldier, army soldier on the right, both white. And see, what he does is he reserves the same space for the Native American in the top right, a little bit down, and then the top left, as Paul pointed out, the Black American, saying, in essence, that they have the same space, the same entitlement to be part of the fabric of America. And this was, as anyone, this is Arthur Szyk in 1945. I mean, he went on to create artwork, during World War II. I need to say something about the genius of the man, and I need to say something about the art, but I hear about the man who was embraced by so many countries. You know how famous he was? He was decorated by the Polish government, the French government in 1923, given a Palme Academique, and in 1931, the Polish government gave the Gold Cross of Merit, and in 1934, the American government gave him the George Washington Bicentennial Medal. This is a Jewish artist decorated with the highest honors of these countries. And they're writing about him. I don't want to lose my train of thought coming back to the to this attacking racism but the countries he was with, but he was a Polish Jew having exhibitions in Paris in the 1920s, and they're writing about him in New York newspapers. And he's being followed in the German press, the Polish press, the Yiddish press, the American press. The people know who he is. And, by the way, you get to the messages because of the genius of the art. I don't want to overlook the art. By the way, in my iteration, you asked me in the beginning how this unfolded with him. I've always felt like the messages were important, but I've come to the final part of this is that behind the great art and the great messages stands the great man. This man was heroic. I mean, I believe he's the artist of and for the Jewish people, because I believe there's no artist engaged in action on behalf of the Jew in the world, and he used his art and was so known as a Jew. Yeah. And always was proud about being a Jew and created art that was Jewish, if not in subject matter, in theme. It was his value system as a Jew that emanated when he created artwork such as this. Yeah. And in World War II, America embraced him. Listen, he was called this is my next point, so citizen soldier of the free world, decorated by the American military. His art exhibited at over 500 USO recreation centers. You know what is that? 500 exhibitions? These were reproduction art, but they were exhibited, but all the military academies also exhibited his original art, and many of them bought them. But this is at the time when he's being celebrated by America, and yet, he's serving him as FDR soldier in art. That's how he saw himself, as a fighting artist to fight the enemy. I know about Roosevelt and all that stuff, but he had a job to do. He fought the enemy. And at the same time, why was he fighting the enemy? Because the Germans were racist, right? The Jew was the subhuman, right? The other peoples were, and it was a German superiority. And what were the Japanese doing? The Japanese were the same racist towards the Asians, towards the Chinese, right? But America, she's fighting them because they're oppressing, they're killing or murdering because of racism. America is racist in its own way and not dealing with it. Blacks and whites couldn't serve together in the same units. So how is Szyk going to deal with this? So he creates artwork that attacks America and the American military that was decorating him and embracing him. And yet he stands up to it, and as he does in so much of his art. This is what I mean by a Jewish artist for me. This is what I mean by a Jewish artist for the Jewish people. This is what I mean for Jewish artists for the world, for an advocate for humanity. I guess I've now said this 3 or 4 times in different ways. I guess you get it. So let me back off now a little bit. Let's take a deep breath.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one last question, and then I'll turn to the audience. There's a curious contradiction here, which is that you've talked about just how famous he was, how lauded he was, how well regarded he was in the wider world, not just the Jewish world. But then you also mentioned that there was this news article which said Irvin Ungar made Arthur Szyk famous because something had happened in the intervening years where his fame had subsided and people weren't talking about him or remembering him or writing about him. Yeah. So my final question before we go to the audience is, I know this is something you explore in the book as well. What do you think happened? What happened to make Szyk underappreciated, underremembered?
Okay. So, by the way, I figured that might be a question in the beginning of the book, and so I make reference to it, and I give the answers at the end of the book. I'm not going to tell your audience, you have to read my book to find out. That won't be fair, really. But I want you to read the book.
I mean, you give a multifaceted answer in the book, so maybe just give a little bit.
Okay, I'll give a little taste. I think we have these expressions, a little taste of the world to come, right, or something. So I don't give the fullness here, right? So just a little taste. Not in any order here. Not in any order. Well, I'll tell you something. If he lived as long as Picasso and Chagall, and his works were as big as Picasso's Guernica, and he lived a long time, a lot of people would know him. A lot more people. He died when he was 57 years old of a heart attack. And when he died, the family thought that before he died, they had formed New Canaan Art Publishing Company to promote his art. But after he died, shortly after he died, it was his son and his wife who were going to promote his art. His son died. And they were going to promote, they had dismissed all the dealers who were working with his art. So there was no dealers and no family to keep his art out there. And then the art world had changed. It was abstract modernism. Szyk was a realist. I mean, who's talking about the Holocaust anyhow in the 1950s and early 60s and then also he works in the style of illuminated manuscripts, which is already anachronistic by 400 years. So the style, of course, in Paris, he went against everything that was being created. And even though some of the most expensive books that were published in Paris were illustrated by Arthur Szyk, and he illustrated numerous books there, he was, I think his art was so diverse in its styles. It's a combination of illuminated manuscripts, of Polish and Slavic folk art. There's some elements of, you can see in some of his work, some elements of searching for a Jewish art form of Bezalel, and he did visit Palestine in 1914. He did visit the land of Israel for 6 months then. There's a whole slew of things. The family sold off all of his art after he died because the wife, Julia, it was important to have some money, and over 300 of his paintings were sold in 4 successive Park Bernet sales in 59, 61, 63, and 1965, and gone from the marketplace was any of his art. And when he died, and also being affiliated with Peter Bergson and the Bergson Group and the Begin and Jabotinsky and the labor government comes in and it's formed, there's not a place for the people he's associated with in talking about them. And in America, he criticized the American Jewish community, even though he loved the American, but he didn't feel they were doing enough to rescue European Jews, as he loved the British, and then because they were fighting against Nazis, but then how he attacked them when their mandate of Palestine, or the Poles, who he had a relationship with. But in 1943, when they went another way, as Szyk saw it, he then went after, he took a different position with regard to Poland. So this is a man who was embraced by all of these and then stood up against them. And so who carried on? Who carried on with Szyk's name? He was forgotten. He wasn't written about even in, I have a book at home because I have books on Jewish art. I handle a lot of different Jewish art of different artists, and I'm familiar with them. But I have a book at home by a man named Schwartz, 100 Great Jewish Artists, and Szyk's name isn't there. I have books on World War II political art, and he's missing.
Wow.
So what is going on? What's happening? I'll tell you something else. Let me not dwell on why not. Let me just tell you, it's never happening again. When I began, there's too much on the internet. There's too much that's been created. When I started with Szyk, there were no books. There was one book about Arthur Szyk. It was in Yiddish, published here in Israel. But the circulation, there were no color illustrations. It really was here, and that was it. And I don't know how many people knew it even existed. So that when I began, there were no books about Szyk, and the internet had just been started, so you couldn't access information. So the whole story of how I really mortgaged my house, I took a second mortgage to buy a reference collection. I borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars because I knew where Szyk's artwork was, his scrapbooks and his personal material, and how I came to acquire that, and what risks I was willing to take to do that, and how I started to make Szyk known really was through the museum world. But it's too much to recount too many of those here. But I realized that that I needed to take a risk because it's something I believe. Like in life, you come this way, you go this way, but you're never going that way again. I guess that serves as a philosophical term for that, as you know. And I just decided I need to do this. And I think the reason I did that is because there was something in me that was like a gambler. And I'll tell you, this is not a secret because I read about, my father won the World Series of Poker in 1997. So maybe the idea of taking risk was somewhat within my world, but I believed in this. And then the first exhibit, I needed to, when I went after a museum in Chicago, the Spurs Museum, and I felt that an exhibit needed to take place, and if I could find museums that would invest their time, their money, and their staff, that would spread the network. And and that's how I started, with finding museums both in the United States and abroad and prestigious institutions. Then it could broaden. And the first time it happened, someone said, yes, we'll do it. I needed to own this material, even though for years I talked with the owner who knew Szyk's daughter, from whom he had gotten the material. And I borrowed several $100,000 to buy reference material. I did buy, there was a warehouse of reproduction prints, not original art, but reproductions. It takes a long time to sell reproduction prints at $25 a print to get your money back, right? But I was running a book business and I would make my money, and I borrowed money from my dad and I paid it all back. And I just realized that I really needed to do this. This is, I've been asked lots of questions about, you're a rabbi, is this like a religious, what kind of mission are you on, like, it's a mission, it's our mission, it's what Szyk really represents, it's what we want. It's what we want. We want to feel proud of who we are, and we want other people to feel proud of who they are and use the best of their tradition to make the world a better place, right? And that's what this artist is. He's an artist who built bridges between peoples and nations. And this is not a lecture about those, and it's not a lecture at all. It's just like, I'm just telling you how I feel and what I've seen in his art. It's like, and by the way, he never wrote descriptions of his artwork. So you have to read his pictures. You do. But if you look at enough of them, you can all do it.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you very much, Irvin Ungar. We have a short amount of questions. Please make your questions a question with a question mark, an audible question mark at the end, not a long statement. Yes, sir. Back.
Beautiful. Could you say something about the values
Value?
around what you did, and the values that the museums had and others who supported your work?
Okay, so about the value of the art. Well, I wore two hats in my life with my work with Szyk. First of all, I was a businessman and I had to make a living. And then the other part was the scholarly part. I'm sure it was the scholarly part that drove the business part, because I took over responsibility for a nonprofit called the Arthur Szyk Society, and I had my business. Well, I wasn't paid as a paid employee at all. I supported it, so I got other people to support it. So it was important to raise money along the way to create exhibitions, which then I traveled throughout the country and stuff like that. But it was also important for me to own Arthur Szyk's art, so I became like a collector of his art. And it was also important to create value. And I talk about this a lot in the book, because, if an artwork sells for $500, if it sells for 5,000 instead of 500, people might look at it. And if the work sells for 5,000, but you can make that artwork worth $50,000, then people pay even more attention. I felt like, if I could build value, that would be another way of calling attention to Szyk's art. Let me just say also here, to make this really clear, because I don't want to be really clear about this. Ben Franklin, we're celebrating coming up, 250 years of America, right? Ben Franklin and the role that he played in America. To paraphrase Ben Franklin, he once said that I would be dishonest if I didn't say that as a result of doing good, I also did well. And that sort of also became part of what I did, because I've also been able to take a lot of the money that I made and put it back into the book publications that I've been able to do, and then send them to institutions and so on. But to create value, you need a marketplace, and Szyk is not widely bought and sold in the market. It just isn't. Sometimes his work will come up at Sotheby's or Christie's or an auction house, but not rarely. I mean, I see his art all the time as people bring it to me, and also I'm active. I buy his art. I needed to own his art because I also have been able to create exhibitions, because I didn't have to go through many channels, and I could just bring the art and make it accessible, and that's what I did. And sometimes I was paid for curating an exhibit, but when I curated an exhibit for the Library of Congress, I received nothing. When I curated an exhibit for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, when we had an exhibit there, I was paid $10,000. And when I curated this exhibit, it's now at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, they're showcasing new artworks that I have acquired over the past decade. And of course, I'm not paid to show that, but I'm paid to be paid in other ways. It's just not why I do what I do, but it happens. So the idea of creating artwork that's even where there's not even really a market, it was my job to sort of create a market of people who are really smart people who would buy artwork at really high values, thousands of dollars. But it doesn't mean that one can't still find pieces and original art and cherish it. And but I'm always happy when I meet someone who owns something, because I'm happy to tell them all I can about it. I'm interested, where was this work exhibited? Where did it appear in a publication? And create that whole history around these artworks. Is that getting close to what you're asking? Because I skirt the issue sometimes. I don't.
A lot more than I asked for.
Okay, so that's what happens with me. You get more than you asked for. You can imagine living with me?
There's a few questions. Okay, I'm gonna go to this gentleman over here, then I'll come to. Yeah.
He was very prolific, as you pointed out, yet all his artwork is so intricate. How long did it take him to do one?
That's an excellent question. I'll repeat it. How long did it take Arthur Szyk to do either one of these art? I can tell you, I know the answer definitively about that work that's on the far left, the United States of America. And I tell the story in the memoir exactly how I know how long it took him. And I can tell you how much he was paid for it. So I'm going to tell you now. Okay. So here's your excuse for not buying the memoir, because now you have the story, but there's many more like this. Let me tell you this. So the war is over, and Casimir Bolesky is a stamp dealer in Canada, and he wants to create frontispieces for stamp albums. So if you collect United States stamps or you collect Israeli stamps in 48, start collecting early stamps or stamps of Palestine before that, you need to have a frontispiece for your stamp album. So Mr. Bolesky came to Arthur Szyk in 1945, and he walked into Szyk's home, or his apartment at that time, which was his office, and he was met by a 20-something-year-old Bernie Gittleson, who was Szyk's agent. And Bolesky from Canada asked Arthur Szyk, how much would it cost? I'll get to how long it took him to do it, but how much did it cost to do each one of these original works of art that Szyk would create of a visual history of each country? So Gittleson told me this story. I went to visit Gittleson in Sarasota, Florida. He was in his 80s. And he told me that I went back to Arthur Szyk and I asked him, and Szyk told me, tell Bolesky I want $1,000. 1945, $1,000. Gittleson walked out and he told Bolesky, I just spoke to Arthur Szyk and he wants $5,000. Bolesky paid it. I'll tell you more about that. I asked Gittleson, how long did it take Arthur Szyk to do this work of art? And he said to me, it took him 1 week. What I didn't tell Gittleson was that a month before I went to see Bolesky in Canada, in Winnipeg, and he was also in his 80s, and I didn't tell this to Gittleson. And when I went to see Bolesky this month earlier, I said to Bolesky, Mr. Bolesky, I know you commissioned Arthur Szyk to create this series. Can I ask you, how much did you pay Arthur Szyk? He said, I paid Arthur Szyk $5,000, but later on I found out that he only wanted $1,000. And then I said to him, Mr. Bolesky, how long did it take to do Arthur Szyk to do that work of art? He says, well, Irv, this is the thing. He says, I paid $5,000 for that, and I got it back in less than a week. From two people on the same work of art, the same story. And which means is he worked really fast, and there were not preliminary drawings for what he was doing. And I once bought over 200 doodles and sketches from Arthur Szyk's daughter, and I can tell you that none of them have ever been reproduced in any completed drawing. And I'm not afraid to say that I've probably seen more original Arthur Szyk artwork than anyone other than Arthur Szyk and his wife Julia. And I have never seen a preliminary drawing or sketch. He did often do an underdrawing. Am I answering your question back there? I answered it much more, but nonetheless, that's the story.
You're getting a sense of the way that Irvin answers.
Yeah, well, the book happily has chapters. So you can put it down as that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go first to the gentleman here with in the blue shirt.
Just remind us, I think you said he was in London for a couple of years?
Yes,
Was his work published anywhere in London? And if so, what sort of publications?
he was in London in the early 30s, and there were exhibitions that were held, first of all, at places there. There was a Jewish paper, Mr. Solomon ran a Jewish Post in London, and he published a few of Szyk's caricatures and cartoons that were anti-Nazi in the early 30s. In fact, one of them is a picture of Hitler standing on top of the Reichstag, where he has a olive branch in one hand, sounds reminiscent, and a gun in the other. And he's wearing sheep's clothing. And by the way, Szyk used to say, never trust a wolf that promises to be a vegetarian. And so he was creating artwork that early in London, published in this Jewish Post, a few pieces. And then in Tide and Time, which was a magazine in London in the late 1930s, a lot of his, number of his pieces were being published there. And in 1940, at the Fine Art Society on Bond Street, they had a major exhibition of Szyk's artwork for all the society to come and see in 1940, which is the same year that his Haggadah is printed in London. And they're writing about him in the newspaper. So in addition to his artwork appearing in the press, they're writing about him. In fact, they wrote about his Haggadah, just taking this a step further, that this book was worthy of being considered among the most beautiful of books ever produced by the hand of man, the Times of London.
Okay, yes, sir.
Yes, you had spoken about the association with Jabotinsky and with Begin, which is well known. Do you have a sense of what language they spoke?
That's a good question. I don't know, but Szyk spoke a number of languages, as you would guess, that many people of his position and influence in where he lived. Obviously, is a fluent French speaker, and he wrote in Yiddish. He wrote in Russian and German. He wrote a poem in German we cannot figure out. It has to do with the Renaissance bumping up against modernity, and I've gone to philosophy professors, German professors, and we can't figure it out. But Szyk's writing about philosophy in German. He wrote Chinese calligraphy. He did a visual history of China, and he illustrated Arabian Nights entertainments, all 40 or 50 paintings there. I don't remember, all in his own script, Arabic script, Persian script. And so Szyk was able to do all of that. What was the language in which he was communicating there? I'm not sure. I can only tell you that I met his best friends Szyk and his wife were friendly with people in New Canaan, Connecticut. So this would have been the late 40s. And I never asked her what language Szyk was. He was speaking English, and he spoke English. He was a short man, blue eyes, and he could speak many languages. But I can tell you what his home was like. Dr. Ida Davidoff said in the year 2000, when I was in New Canaan, and there was a mini exhibit at the New Canaan Historical Society. She said that Arthur Szyk's home was like a Chekhov play. People were coming and going, and Samovar was going, and all of this action. But he sang in different languages. He sang in French. He sang in, I don't know, probably Polish. But he had favorite songs. He sang. He was a hater of hate. Make no question about that. But he was also the life of a party. If you came with jokes, and this was an amazing human being. I can't wait till the full-length motion picture is made, which is I've been working towards that over the past 20 years, and it's now time. I don't have
Who's going to play Szyk?
Send me your email, send me your, and we'll give a special Haggadah to the one who wins the caption, the one who turns out to suggest the person who really wins it. I don't know yet.
Okay.
I don't even know if it'll be me, but yes. I'm working towards it.
Okay. one last question, this lady in the front.
His art is anti-Nazi. In what way did it actually bring awareness to people about being about what was happening in Germany?
Well, I can say the way in which he did this from the beginning in 1939 and 40, he was already doing drawings of the oppression of the Jews, the heroism of the Poles, and the savagery of the Germans and the Russians. Already he's doing this in 1939 and 1940. And this artwork is appearing in places. So how does he bring the attention? Is from the very beginning, because he created all of his artwork always for reproduction purposes. These are for reproduction. He never created artwork to match the colors of the sofa in the living room. That was not Szyk. Art had to have a message. So it was the magazines and newspapers. It was the covers that he was doing for all the. That's how he was delivering the message. He was having exhibitions. If I haven't said this adequately, then I don't want to summarize the whole thing. But his art is everywhere in America. It's in billboards in Times Square. It's on the cover of phone directories in Manhattan. It's on poster stamps that you put on envelopes. A typical day in New York City, you saw Szyk in the New York Post. You saw him on the cover of the phone directory. You saw him on the exhibition at Knoedler or Wildenstein's galleries where Picasso might have been the previous week, and Szyk is there. You're seeing him in billboards in Times Square at 7th Avenue and 42nd Street. You're seeing him in magazines, in newspapers. You're seeing him everywhere. And he's delivering a message to the American people. And he is being written about. And he's on committees with important people. When he's in London, he's the chairman of the Polish Jews in exile in London to raise awareness of what's going on to the Jews in Poland. This is an artist, but this is someone who is willing to, he's serving on these committees, and he's very engaged with issues that are taking place also with, and by the way, everyone knew him. He created the first Israel bond certificate. I have a picture of Albert Einstein holding the bond that Szyk created. He created the Four Freedoms Award for the Four Freedoms Foundation. Harry Truman's holding Szyk's art. Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann signed Arthur Szyk's Israel bond certificate. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone. And everyone saw his art. So with that, did I get passionate there?
In keeping with the general tone, but it's been wonderful, Irvin, and I think you talked about how known he was, how famous he was, how loved he was, and thanks to you, I think if he will be again, it will be because of you. So I want to have a big round of applause for Irvin Ungar.
This is the bonus, okay? Because you stayed to the end, so you're entitled to this. This work is entitled deep, as you can see, De Profundis. This is Szyk's calligraphy. What is De Profundis? De Profundis is really a Latin phrase for out of the depths. Psalm 137. 137. Out of the depths I call to you, O Lord. It's really fundamental to both Jewish and Christian theology. So therefore, from the beginning, you're going to get this idea that there's more than one audience being addressed here in this work of art of De Profundis. What do we see? We see lifeless and dying Jews, and we see that Szyk has painted among them Jesus, holding the Ten Commandments, as if to say in 1943 in New York, when Szyk created this artwork, if Jesus had been alive in Europe, he too would have been killed as a Jew. And he's holding in his hands the most recognizable, perhaps, symbol of the Jewish and Christian traditions, the Ten Commandments. At the time this work has been created, there were already, in my mind, two other works that were highly significant that documented the tragedy of the Jews in Europe, or of the murder of innocents in Europe, and then the Jewish people. First, Picasso in 1937 created Guernica in response to the bombing of Guernica. In 1938, Marc Chagall created a painting called White Crucifixion. Some say it was in response to Picasso's Guernica. Others know that it was also in response to Kristallnacht and the Anschluss and everything that was going on in 1938. And he creates in this painting a burning synagogue, a house aflame, a Jew fleeing with a Torah scroll. And in the center of White Crucifixion, Chagall paints a huge cross and Jesus on the cross. You know, this is a piece. It's controversial for some Christians and Jews. Nonetheless, what does Picasso's Guernica and Chagall's White Crucifixion and Arthur Szyk's De Profundis have in common? They all document human tragedy. But Szyk does something else. That by adding the verse of Cain, where is Abel thy brother? Szyk is talking about responsibility. Who is going to be held accountable for this? Now, I mentioned that everything that he created was for the purpose of reproduction. Where was this reproduced? This was reproduced full page in the Chicago Sun in February of 1943. Now, in November of 1942, it's already made known publicly to the world that 2 million Jews had been murdered in Europe. So this appears full page in the Chicago Sun. My question to you is, which I'm going to answer, is how did it get there? Was it the owner of the Chicago Sun who said, we're going to put this there? And the answer is no. Was it the managing editor or the senior editor who selected this to be put there? No. Okay, so what Jewish group paid for this to get in the Chicago Sun full page? And the answer is no Jewish group paid for it. It's paid for by a Protestant group, by a group called the Protestant Textbook Commission, which said in it, because when this was published full page in the Chicago Sun, this is across the top, there's text down the bottom. And that text says that because of the anti-Semitism that we have taught in our textbooks over the generations and the seeds of hatred that we have sown over millennium, we as Christians have to be held accountable for this, because not only is it anti-Semitic and anti-American, but it's anti-Christian itself. And that's how Szyk's art was used in 1943, and it appeared there full page. And why do I think or believe that this is the single most important work on the Holocaust created during the war? Because it's not only documenting tragedy, it's calling for responsibility and accountability at the very moment. And then it's the most reproduced of any of Arthur Szyk's artwork during World War II. And seminars and lectures and discussions were being held over this work of art, one of them in Kew Gardens, Queens, near Forest Hills, which is where I was, is around my first time, but of course I wasn't there in 1943 when these were taking place. So this got wide circulation. It delivered an unbelievable, not unbelievable, but unbelievable message. And if you know what I mean by unbelievable, and it's documenting even tragedy. This work of art is only about this size. That's the size of this work. And it's pen and ink and pencil, you know, on a board, really. It's not just paper, but it's a little thicker than that. And this is reproduced. It's now in the collection in the Magnus collection of Jewish Art and Life at UC Berkeley, which is on the UC at the Magnus Museum, which is at UC Berkeley, and that's where this art now resides. And that is the story behind De Profundis.
Did you say that there were symbols in the letters?
Yes, and so even, and thank you, Lana, for pointing that out. If you look carefully, if you come up close, and you can come up close after I finish, in the C of Cain, there's a swastika. In the A of Abel, you'll see a Star of David. Among the calligraphy, you'll see Job here. And also the words Eli, Eli, like almost the last words of Jesus, you know, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you'll find here, look, what's that?
Skull and crossbones.
You'll find skull and crossbones. It's here. You'll find over here the angel of death, and the finger. You know, when I think of another painting where someone's reaching out with the finger, you look at the Sistine Chapel and you look, and it's almost, someone mentioned this to me the other day. It's like between this and this, in this space, you know, one can ask questions about that one wants to ask at a time of great tragedy. Where is the divine presence? Where is humanity? Where is all the questions that Szyk in this great piece is hoping to point out? Someone asked that maybe this was the Warsaw Ghetto that's behind here, but the Warsaw Ghetto uprising wasn't until Passover in April of 43, and this appears a couple of months before that. So it wouldn't be the tragedy of the destruction of the ghetto to that extent, as it was, although I find that, but these are images. People often ask me, I'm going to stop with this, I keep going, but people often ask me, you know, like, these faces, who are they? Did Szyk know them? Are these people? I think he knew them, but he didn't know them. I mean, he knew them because he felt these people, but they aren't his grandmother or his aunt or the child that he knew. And I used to talk with his daughter all the time about who are these faces. I can tell you that in the book of Esther, Szyk's wife is still this beautiful Julia. Her face is reproduced quite often, and in other words. But here you have two Profundis. So, thank you.
Are there any descendants
What's
still,
that?
are any of Szyk's descendants still alive?
Yeah, his Alexandra's three daughters are, and they really respected, loved their grandfather. He dedicated several of his, one of his books, Anderson's Fairy Tales, was dedicated to the older of the three granddaughters, and he planted through Mother Goose to another daughter, and so. But yes, and so there are descendants for sure, great grandchildren.